Righty, my fellow old rollers, welcome to the show. Back for his second episode. My instructor, my coach, and in many ways my inferior, Michael Seals.
I will agree with that. That's true. We'll just be very specific about what those areas are.
Well, this is supposed to be kid friendly, so I can't go into too deep a detail about it. But we brought you back because from talking to you, I picked up a lot from doing the show, and wanted to have someone to kind of discuss maybe some lessons learned or something. So this is going to be kind of a recap of the episodes that we've published, and excited to have your perspective, both as a practitioner and as a coach who's done jiu-jitsu and grappling for much longer than I have, to kind of compare and contrast what someone of my perspective might see versus someone of your perspective, like in terms of just pure time, but also in training. So trying to put, like wouldn't say a capstone, but just, reevaluating and trying to pick up the biggest lessons from the people so far. So welcome back to the show. I've been talking too much. Sorry about that. It's very, very good to have you. And kind of just take us through, like, you've listened to all the shows. What things have really stood out, like, just really stuck to you as like these things are really important?
Well, one thing has just been just how open and willing everybody is to just share. That's been really awesome. I mean, these are really high-level people that have been grappling for tons of time, and they've just been willing to share, just very openly, very share. And so that's been pretty awesome overall. Like, they're just, very forthcoming with stuff. So I just want to say congratulations. You're doing a great job. That's kind of one of the first things, it's like, it's been pretty awesome just to see this in general. So
That's the first time you've ever said good job to me in the entire time I've known you.
not entirely true, but I'll say it's probably one of a handful of times. Give me 1 second. I need to shut this door really fast. Okay.
Sure thing. So for those listening on audio, Michael Seals was unprepared, like he is usually for class, and so he's just going to wing it. And
I typically do wing it. I don't know what you're talking about.
time,
I wing it all the time. I don't know. That's kind of how I roll in general. I just wing it. Um, but anyways, one of the first things, like one of the big things that really stood out to me, and this was like so many of the people that you had on the show discussed, was just culture or environment in a gym or on a mat. And that was just one of those things, like, it was like he said it, he said it, he said, like, it was just like one after the other was saying it, and it's like we'd be remiss to not discuss it in some fashion. From one of the big things that kind of stood out to me is it was like the head coach, head instructor, whatever, is the person who kind of sets the tone for the culture of the gym. And that most of these guys, even people who like they're like, my primary goal is not I have like world-class competitive mat with sock bombs, and I think that world-class competitor should be able to get something out of a match with soccer mom. Did I lose you?
Mike, I think do you still have me? Having some issues. I don't know if it's my internet or your internet. So I'm showing good internet access. We'll give it a second. Maybe Michael will come back. If we're looking at this just purely on audio, maybe we'll have to switch to LTE. That might be, looks like we've lost Michael completely.
Oops, sorry about that.
Hey, so was that me or was that you?
That was me. My internet sometimes does this when I'm on my Zoom meetings. It just like
Okay,
random.
that is I'm actually switching internet provider because I've had some troubles too.
Yeah, it just randomly drops it sometimes for me. So I apologize about that.
No sweat.
Um,
So when we
where
lost you, you were saying that you were talking about culture, then you had kind of segued a little bit into what Coach Matt Thornton from SBG was talking about, which was the idea that a 25-year-old MMA fighter should be able to get useful and valuable training with a 50-year-old soccer mom if it's done
Mhm.
correctly. And that was a really fascinating point to me. Like, what was your take on that?
That I mean, it was fascinating to me as well. Especially because if I drew from my experience, that I didn't have a coach or somebody telling me that. Like, hey, it doesn't matter who you got coming in, make use of them. Like they can be valuable to you if you just find the right way of making them valuable. And like when you were having a discussion with Rob Bernacki, and it was discussing like, both like Hodger Gracie and Rafael Lovato Jr., two of the like best grapplers of kind of our generation. Neither one of them, when they were at like peak competing time for jiu-jitsu, had anything really remotely close to another world-class competitor in their gym. They had a lot of like white belt and blue belts, but they developed a way to turn these people into what they needed. And what I thought that was fascinating, this guy who makes a living doing this is like, hey, I want that 25-year-old beast on the mat with this soccer mom, and she should feel safe, and not only should she feel safe, her husband should feel safe sending her there. And then this little 25-year-old fighter should be able to get benefit out of training with her. I was like, just kind of mind-blowing compared to some of the gyms I've trained in over the years, where it was like, husbands were definitely not sending their wives. They probably aren't going themselves. Like they may even reconsider sending that 25-year-old fighter in there too. So, just kind of one of those really interesting things from this, and SBG has this just like, I mean, they're all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's just this fantastic thing. And to hear it and from him where he's like, but it comes from that top and it comes from leading from the front. And so it was like that really stands out to me is I'm in the process of building my own gym, opening my own place, and it's like if I don't absorb this in some fashion, this is a huge mistake on my part, because this is just gold. Like, lead from the front, set a good example of what to do.
Well,
And
and kind of, like combining with that, the one that surprised me the most was so far has been the Joel Bain one, because Joel is a giant dude. Um, and his primary art is catch wrestling, though he's got a black belt in judo, second degree black belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. He's trained in sambo. He's competed not at the world class level, but certainly at a national level and potentially at world if it weren't for some injuries in amateur wrestling and Greco. And but coming from that catch wrestling background, it has been, kind of taught to me to think, and not necessarily by you, but by, like just the culture in general, that catch wrestling is pretty aggressive. I mean, they call themselves this violent art as kind of a way of differentiating from the gentle art, so to speak. But I was very surprised at what he had to say, which was that, when we bring someone in, initially, we expect them to tap to pressure, and we're going to introduce that pressure slowly and explain what's going on. And then when it gets too much, we expect you to tap, and it's okay. Like, nobody's mad about it. And his language was, we're here to build you up, not to beat you up.
mm-hmm.
And that sounded so much like what Matt Thornton was saying about a 25-year-old MMA fighter with a 50-year-old soccer mom in the same role. It's like, if we put ourselves in a place where, not necessarily handicapping, but trying to work with what they have to work with, then we can find valuable training in that 5 to 10 minute role or whatever. And valuable training, if we're getting better, is valuable training. It doesn't matter if it's like, Conor McGregor training with, his sparring partners, because he's an SBG guy. Mm-hmm. Or it's Conor McGregor in class with a 50-year-old soccer mom. The expectation is that he's still getting good training, but it's on him to find the way to get it.
Right. And I think that placing the impetus on like the skill and technique development is just huge. And he wasn't the only one. I mean, you kind of looked at that as a bunch of the guys have discussed, just kind of skill development, technique. Those are things that A, give you longevity, but B, just make you better, period. If you really focus on that skill and technique and developing your game, whereas like if I'm 25 going against another 25-year-old, it may be A game versus A game. And that's what's really sharpening us up. And if it's the 25-year-old and that 50-year-old soccer mom, maybe he's using that stuff that he just learned. Mm-hmm. He doesn't really know how to do it yet. And he says, well, can I really work on this skill development and not use any attributes? Mm-hmm. And that was a big thing just kind of across the board. A lot of these coaches were talking about was just like, hey, skill development. You don't have to go hard all the time. You don't have to roll all the time. You can put yourself in a position to get something out of every roll. Mm-hmm. Kind of regardless of what that person is doing, you can make it a beneficial role for both people.
Yeah, I think what has really intrigued me so far is that it seems that there is an overlap between skill development and longevity. Mm-hmm. If the purpose of the Old Rollers podcast is to figure out how to roll as dangerously as possible for as long as possible, it seems that, if you go to Pareto's principle, the 80% might just be the skill development. Like the longevity, there's a portion of it that may take care of itself if we focus on skill development over. It's funny. I'm going to have him on the show here in the near future, but a really famous teacher named Jonathan Thomas, he just put out a post today on Instagram talking about the idea that if you're trying to win every role, you're slowing down your skill development. Like, he was not like talking about the podcast. He was just talking about how to train. He's like, if you're trying to only win every role, then you are limiting the number of possible technical solutions you are able to use. Because just like you said, if I'm training with a 50-year-old woman, if I play my A game on her and she's, not very, very experienced, it's just going to crush her. And then like, I don't get great training, but she doesn't either. Mm-hmm. But if I say, winning and losing here is less important to me than skill acquisition or skill development, then I will work on a set of skills that I'm not good at and try to put them, to maybe not to their paces, but to see how I can apply them with this person who, is potentially in some area more skilled than me. Like my skills in aggregate may be better than theirs, but in, this one area, they may actually be really, really good. And that kind of goes back to that Hodger Gracie thing where he was assessing his own mat and finding out, who has good skill in blank, and then spending all of his time working within that with that person and then making them better and better at it. Mm-hmm. In aggregate, they're certainly not a world-class black belt. They're not going to go to worlds with him. But in that one area, they can give him world-class training, which is a pretty fascinating thing. And, like using the Conor McGregor example, he can train at SBG, and sure, he's going to spar with, like the MMA fighters, in his MMA rounds. But in his grappling and jiu-jitsu, he should be able to get valuable training and skill development. And what's fascinating about that is that skill development, because it is lower on the intensity scale, also plays into longevity, which I didn't expect that, honestly. That was not an outcome that I thought I would find. So I'm very interested in, and I'm talking a little bit too much. Like the point of the podcast is not for me to talk, but I'm gushing a little bit because I'm just so excited to have found these commonalities like you're talking about.
Yeah, that, and like you said, that's, he said it, and then there were several other people that have been on the podcast that have said that exact same thing, where it's like if you're only ever trying to win, you have a ceiling. And we've seen it with people that we've trained with. Like there's a ceiling effect. That ceiling could be pretty high. I mean, that person, just based on their attributes or whatever their game is, that ceiling could be really high, but it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think those people who really focus on that just skill development over time, their ceiling is much higher, like it, and if that ceiling even exists for them necessarily, but if your focus is just on that winning and losing, like you're going to limit your potential development. In the long term, you will just limit it. But like they said, you could be very successful in the short term. Like for a short period of time, you can be extremely successful. And if that's what your goal is, then, like a few people were like, well, if that's what their goal is, I just tell them to go somewhere else because I don't want them around. And I was like, and that goes back to culture set up by the head coach,
When the Silver Fox was like, if they're like that, then I'll just send them to a meathead factory.
Yes. Oh yeah. That was really good, but it's just really funny to see like several people were just like, yeah, I just, if that's what they're all about, I just send them somewhere else. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty interesting, but it does keep that culture how you want it, and if your culture is focused on skill development, safety, speaking of the Silver Fox saying like his his kind of, let me peek at my notes really quick. His top 3 things for a great school was world-class instruction, that kind of friendly, welcoming atmosphere, a safe atmosphere, and then a clean facility.
Yeah.
And like, wow, if you boiled it all down, I was like, that's fascinating to me that was. And then when you look at, I think both Rob and Seth, I think both said the same thing as well in terms of just like in instruction, like that world-class instruction is super important, and you don't have to be a world-class competitor to give world-class instruction. And that was another just kind of fascinating thing that has kind of popped up across as well. It's like they don't have to be a high-level competitor to give high-level instruction.
Well, and going even further than that, where Seth Smith was talking about some of the lapel guards that people like Keenan Cornelius have really kind of introduced to the competitive atmosphere. At first, Seth was like, I don't really want to learn that. Like, I don't want to teach it. I don't want to learn it. I don't care. And then as he watched people, in his gym just experimenting with it on their own, some of them thought it was really fun, and because they thought it was fun, suddenly they became pretty good at it. And so he took up learning it so that he could help those people who, wanted to get it. And he said, I can't remember if he said it's become a part of his game or if purely just as a teacher, it's good to know, like just because he can hand it off. But either way, he was basically opening up and saying like, this was a thing that I didn't think was all that great. It's like, but now I think it's pretty cool, because he just took the time to play with it himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's great, because it kind of goes along with what some of these other guys have said, where it's like, everybody needs kind of a core group of skills, a core group of movements, some fundamentals, so to speak. But then you let that other person then express their game. Like, we're not trying to make a bunch of clones of Keenan, right? That'd be really hard to do. We're not trying to make a bunch of clones of Ryan Hall. It'd be hard to do. But
could though.
Yeah, it'd be awesome. But it's like you just have to teach some fundamental movements, some fundamental skills, and then let that person kind of develop their own flavor. So just because he didn't like doing lapel guard stuff, some of his students did. And he's like, well, they like it. I want to make them better. So I'm going to invest a little bit of time and energy into it so I can help them become better. And by them becoming better, now then comes back around full circle and makes him better. because now he's got to deal with these people who suddenly became good at a skill that he didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
So
go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say what was also neat about that is that just like what you said about not creating clones, that was another thread that kind of flowed through almost everyone, is that everyone seems to believe in this concept of a set of, sort of fundamental skills that are necessary. You have to be able to do certain movements, but then after that, outside of that, how you express them is completely like the choice of the practitioner or the artist. So, if you can't shrimp, we'll say, or hip escape, that's going to make it challenging to be good at grappling.
Yeah.
But if you can, there's a whole lot of places that can express itself, that movement of your hips can express itself. And so what you choose, that'll be yours, And talking with Josh Mancuso, we both kind of geeked out on the Ryan Hall concept of your training partners in a certain way drive your training more than your teacher does. Because whatever you like, you'll probably get pretty good at it. So let's just say, like, we'll use berimbolo, which is, a thing that a lot of people look at and say, maybe not so great. Well, if you like it and you get good at it, you'll be good at it. Mm-hmm. And then at first, if your training partners have never seen it, you'll have a lot of success right out of the gate because they've never seen it. But then after a few times, they'll develop their own responses to it, and suddenly it'll be less successful. And that's kind of the moment, that moment where it loses its very high success rate, where you have the chance to actually become good at it. Mm-hmm. Initially, you were just successful because they didn't know what was going on. Once that has passed, now you have either you can continue to develop that skill and create answers to their answers, or you can say, maybe this isn't for me, and you can move on. Either of those choices is a fine choice. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the artist's choice. But if you can express the fundamental movements, then you can start a berimbolo and still be doing the fundamentals. Mm-hmm. A berimbolo, just like Joel Bain said, it's a Granby roll. Like, that's a movement. It's been doing it in wrestling for hundreds of years. So, but how that expresses itself, via the berimbolo is up to the practitioner.
Mm-hmm. It's just like the just fundamentals in general, and also kind of assessments. And those were two things that were also just like, again, across the board in a lot of these people we talk to. And that could be assessment of skills or assessment of just movements. Movements both kind of on and off the mat. You've talked to some strength conditioning people and some PTs and things like that. That was another thing, it was like, hey, what's your needs? Like, if you can't sit in the bottom of a squat, man, like getting down into a combat base or doing like a knee slice or something like that might be pretty hard. Because like, if you physically can't move your body that way, it's going to inhibit your ability to do certain techniques. Just some of those, again, fundamental movement patterns. Like, if your leg doesn't bend all the way, you're going to be limited just by sheer mechanics of that restriction, right? So it's like, maybe you need to fix that restriction, and then you'll suddenly open up a whole new world of things. But it was again fascinating. Like, like Escaloni and Jim and a few of these other people were just like, they discussed the assessments and like having kind of an honest needs assessment. And then also just like one of my favorite things was do your actions match your goals? Mm-hmm. And it's like, I want to have a really flexible game. Are you stretching much? Well, not really. Well, maybe we should reevaluate this whole idea of having a flexible game if you're not a naturally flexible person or you don't spend time on it,
Yeah, and if you're like me and you have a little bit of pudge, like playing a game like that is not going to work out so well, because even if you are flexible, that just creates so much, trunk pressure that all of a sudden, I could potentially run risk of injury, whereas someone who just had, even a little bit better body composition would be much less likely to be injured by that simple motion. Mm-hmm. So I've committed to burning down some of this belly fat of mine so that I can start rolling around on top of my head and stuff. I'm kidding, by the way. But it is a thing that, you know, you also do have to consider what can your body express well. And, you know, just like you said, if you can't bend your leg, you're going to have to build a game around that leg not bending. And there is a game out there for you, but you have to find it, you know.
Yeah.
Or if you can't bend your leg because you just haven't practiced or stretched, maybe your best effort would be spent learning how to bend the leg, you know, like go either way again, express the art however you like, but it will come down to your choices, what you know, and also your limitations. Maybe the leg just won't bend. You know?
Well, it was just like, you know, it was just fascinating. I can't remember who was discussing it when they were discussing kind of that like inversion and rolling around and stuff. Maybe it was Seth. I don't remember, because he was referring back to Ryan, and he was like, man, you know, it was one of the things like I've discussed, like the way I learned to invert stuff was like you were getting stacked on your neck. Like the people who taught it to me didn't do a good job of teaching it, because maybe they didn't have a good teacher teaching them. And so it was like I discarded inversion for a long period of time, because it was like I don't want people on my neck. I want to be grappling for a long period of time. So I have to discard this technique because it's going to be bad for me. And it was like, well, when he's inverting, he's not inverting on his neck, he's doing it on his shoulders and places like that, to where it's like those things can take that. And so it's like some of it is just, is that movement not right for you, or do you not actually have an understanding of that movement and how it could be done safely for you? You know, like there's some version of this move out there for you, you know, and whether you actually want it or not, there is a version that you can do. And that was something, again, that kind of popped up throughout, is it's like, again, whether it's on the mat or off the mat, there's some version, and this is just like from our kind of PT or strength and conditioning standpoint, like it's your progressions and regressions, right? So there is some version of an exercise, some version of a skill, some version of a movement that you will be able to do. We won't express it the same way, but we'll be able to do some version of the same. You know, we'll be able to do some version of a knee bend. It may be a little different, some version of a bridge, some version of a shrimp, whatever it is. We'll do it a little differently, but there's a version that works for us, you know, kind of regardless of what's going on, there's a version that's going to work for us, you know. And that just popped up time and time again. And so it was like, okay, need to remember this. Like, it doesn't matter what the movement is, there's something out there for that person. So whatever their restriction or issue is, doesn't matter. You can find something for them.
That really kind of solidified itself when I was talking to Sambo Stephen Kepfer, and he was talking about the sort of methodology for learning and training that he was handed down from his coach at New York Combat Sambo, who came from Russia, and that the Russians didn't have a whole lot of formality. There wasn't a lot of, you know, like they didn't bow, and they, you know, just kind of shook hands or whatever. And they treated it a lot more like a wrestling room than a dojo, where it was almost like a technique lab. And it's like, okay, today we're working on Uchimata. Here's how I do it. Now let's see if we can figure out how you need to do it. You know, and
yeah,
they were looking at the mat as a lab. So if we go back to that idea of skill development, I think that is also looking at the mat like a lab, where what you're saying is, I may never be good at Uchimata, you know, and that may be never a thing that I study or try to get better at. Maybe it's a thing that I study and try to get better at and have a really hard time, and it takes a long time. Either way, I can make a decision. I can say, okay, Uchimata is not for me. I'm going to study and learn other things. Well, that's still operating on the mat like a lab. Or I can say, I think this Uchimata is really cool and I really want to use it. So it's going to take me some time to figure out how I can put it to work. And that really, I guess, you know, like I said, the podcast is not about me, but the times when I've done the best, even when something was really hard, were the times when I sat down and said, I'm going to become good at this, you know, and no matter what it takes, as long as if I'm working, I will figure it out. And a lot of times I haven't necessarily figured it out, but I've learned stuff along the way that I was then able to reapply to other things. So maybe this thing that was the initial goal that I said, I'm going to get good at this, maybe that didn't happen, but because I was treating the mat like a lab, other things did.
Mm-hmm.
Versus if I was just, like out of the gate, I got a pretty decent knee cut pass. Well, if I just kept doing that over and over and over and over and over again, that's not going to necessarily lend itself to getting much better. Like maybe I'll get a world-class knee cut pass. Well, what I'm going to do if somebody has world-class knee cut pass defense, like, that's the one thing that they just kill on. Well, now all of a sudden I'm in a bind,
Yeah, that just goes back to, I think, the culture, just like what is on the mat. Is it that, again, is the idea of skill development, because there were several people that kind of mat is a lab.
Yeah.
Again?
I hear you, but I don't see you, but that's okay because it's probably still recording you. We're going to fire Mike's internet. So for those on audio, Mike has probably gotten booted again. So I think that's fair, just because he's a terrible teacher, a terrible coach, a terrible human being. We'll give him a minute. Keep talking shit about him. He deserves it. Yeah, here he comes.
It's the joys of technology. What can we say?
You're gonna really enjoy the playback on this one.
I don't even want to know.
I filled up the dead air.
That's great. That's awesome. No, so I think so going back to like the mat as a lab, it's just kind of like, what's the environment in that gym in general? Are you discussing is there really an atmosphere of like skill development and things like that? Because so many people discuss safety, so one of the parts of longevity is safety.
Yeah.
So, those are kind of things that are hand in hand. If you're not training in a safe place, you probably overall, like just by sheer odds, there's going to be a bunch of people falling off. If you're not training in a safe place, you're just not going to have a lot of longevity for most people. So you have that opportunity to try different things and to develop these skills if it's safe. If that guy's only ever saying like, all I'm going to do is get to headquarters and smash pass from there and get to mountain and take your back and rear naked choke you, and that's all I'm ever going to do. Well, like, how much chance do you have to really develop some more skill? Like that person doesn't have your best interest in heart. And so it's like, well, do I really want to roll with this person? They don't really want to help me get any better. And so, it's just that kind of, what's the culture there in general? So if your culture, I think, is that just kind of, again, progressively getting better and getting everyone better, it's very easy to go in and be like, this is a lab. I get to try this. And if I screw it up, oh, well, because this guy's not going to kill me. Mm-hmm. And that's awesome. That's an awesome type of place to be in. And it was fascinating to hear that from like Kulikov as well. He discussed that. It was like, man, you didn't get hurt, like you just did smart things. Like you trained these certain ways. And he's like, that was a fun interview, by the way. Like he was a really cool dude. Like,
up here and it's hard to beat Vlad Kulikov, man.
Man, that was, sorry, I'm geeking out now. I'm glad I wasn't on that one. I was geeking out for it. But that was a ton of fun. But like you said, like kind of both Sambo Steve and Vlad, obviously both have spent time in Russia, and they both kind of discuss that same thing where it's like there's so much skill development that goes on. And everybody always thinks of like Russian training is just intensity. And it turns out it's like, well, it's the opposite. It's so much skill development. And also, if you have a really high level of skill, and several other people discuss this, is like if your skill level is really high, your intensity can actually be relatively high as well because it's still done safely.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like that was another kind of fascinating thing. It's like, man, they're working on skill, but they're working on skill at a pretty high kind of quote unquote intensity level. But for them, it's not. It's not actually that high of an intensity. It's just skill practice, because their base level is so high. He discusses he discussed even the gymnastics training and just kind of, again, basic movement things, which like Escaloni and Jim Laird and some of the other guys have discussed as well. It's like, if you are just a fully functional person, you've got no injuries, you've been training your whole life, you have all these basic fundamental movement patterns, like your ability to do more intense things is going to be higher because you just have that capability. Whereas if you're kind of broken down and decrepit going into it, it's like your intensity level needs to be ratcheted down because you just can't handle it, or you can't handle it in a safe fashion. And again, one of the big purposes of the podcast has been like, what's longevity? How can we get to this idea of longevity? And being broken doesn't lead to longevity.
Certainly.
But being healthy and being able to do things leads to longevity.
Did you have the chance to give the Lachlan Giles interview a listen yet?
I haven't yet. No, it's definitely on the docket. I'm kind of actually partly into Josh's interview right now, the Josh Mancuso one.
Yeah. So I'm not going to rush you on that one, but what you're talking about of building up is a huge thing. Like for him, he talks about that, about the body's ability to adapt and to up its adaptation rate. So Jim Laird talked about this. He calls it work capacity. Mm-hmm. And so if he's going to train someone to get stronger, the first thing he's going to do is assess and see, like, what are they doing that interrupts their recovery? Well, recovery is the time period in which the body adapts to its stimuli. Mm-hmm. So his first thing is, what are we doing that's screwing up your recovery? Once he has that in line, then he starts moving toward work capacity. And once he's built work capacity, then he starts thinking about intensity. So he's like, what can you adapt to? That's the recovery side. Then he starts building work capacity, which is training the body to adapt. Then he takes that skill and moves it to higher intensities. And if you listen to that from a strength training standpoint, that's a lot of what Lachlan said too. Mm-hmm. But he said it through grappling language. So initially, if you're just starting out, maybe doing 5 days a week is not for you, because you have to train your body how to take this. So starting out, maybe 2 or 3 days a week, but don't change that for a while. Don't make it less and don't make it more. Get your body to a place, a threshold, where it can adapt to this training stimulus. Then you can move it up. But as you move it up, you're also going to have to back down the intensity, because if intensity and volume are here and here, if you up the volume without changing the intensity, you've just created a window of potential injury. Mm-hmm. But if you move them like this, well, then the balance sort of stays in that golden zone, this sort of sweet spot. And so I don't know that intuitively I felt that there were a lot of crossovers between strength training and jiu-jitsu. We know that being strong in jiu-jitsu is almost like an insult. Like if I'm grappling with you, I pick on you a lot and talk about big guy shit. Because like anytime you beat me, which is basically every time, I just say, oh, that was big guy shit, Michael. It wouldn't work if I was bigger. That's the jiu-jitsu joke. But like I said, I did not think that there would be so many parallels between strength and conditioning and jiu-jitsu because of that joke. But in reality, it seems like they are very parallel. It does make sense in that they're both physical skills. Like strength is a skill, believe it or not. Like, in order to lift well, you have to lift correctly and lift well. So I do see I've learned to see more of a parallel between those skills and maybe many others. That was unexpected to me though. But just like what you said, that idea of building your adaptive ability, that itself is a thing that you can periodize, even in jujitsu. You know, we would always periodize that in strength training, but I didn't think of it, you know, in terms of grappling.
Yeah, it was also so kind of along those lines of like building that adaptation ability. I can't remember who was it that was talking about marathon rolls. Like they do marathon rolls on like Fridays. They do like 11
Yep.
5-minute rounds or whatever on
That
Friday.
was Steph Smith, and then Sambo Steve talked about it, like rolling for 10 hours at a charity thing. And then Matt Thornton talked about when they give black belts, they do, you know, like really
Shark
long,
Tank, yeah.
Shark Tank too. And that was something that was really fascinating to me, that a lot of people do those. We always have like that open mat on Friday, and it's similar to that. We don't call it like a marathon roll or anything, but it sounds like in design it's a lot like it.
It very much is. But one of the fascinating things was like, you know, if you can't make it through 3 rounds in a normal day, like that's probably not for you. Like, you know, because it was really interesting because I think Seth was like, man, we just don't let people do it. Like, you're not allowed to sit out unless you have a physical reason. Like, you're not allowed to sit out. Like, if you came in for that class, like, guess what? You're doing all 11 rounds. Like,
And
you
okay,
signed up for,
just get out there and do it.
yes. And that, I thought that was so fascinating, you know, because there's a lot of stuff now where it's like, oh, you don't feel okay, just you can just take it off, you know, like just don't do that. Or, you know, like there's kind of that, it's like that catch 22 is like, do you make the person do it? Or do you say like, hey, it's okay, like rest now, you know, do it later, you know? And so like that was a fascinating thing where it's like, hey, to be ready for that though, like you have to be doing stuff during the week. So if you're not able to do stuff during the week, don't even bother stepping on the mat. Like you're kind of wasting your time, but B, everybody else's time. Because like you may have just cost somebody around. Like they're looking up and you're the person that they have to roll with, and you're suddenly sitting over on the side. Now that person's like, well, hey, like I thought, like I came here to get my marathon roll in, and now you're kind of forcing me to not get that, you know.
And you know, it made me think a lot about Seth's, you know, kind of mat culture too, because Sambo Steve said that the place that he's seen the highest likelihood of injury is what he called that just one more.
Mm-hmm.
You're starting to see a dramatic reduction in performance, and your body is saying, hey, we need to shut this down. And then, like I said, with Seth Smith's marathon rolls, he's saying if you come in to show up for the hour, we expect you to go for the hour.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, I kind of thought maybe those two things are in violation. But what he is saying is that we don't care how you perform. So if you get 4 rolls in and you're just dying, well, it's going to be a bad roll for you, but we want you to do it anyway. Don't try and ballistically, you know, like jump out of stuff and, you know, like just freak out. Let yourself loose. Let yourself do what you can, you know, at your reduced performance now due to fatigue. That doesn't mean try with all your might. It means try to be technical even while tired. And that's where I had a hard time at first reconciling those two, but from re-listening to Seth Smith, like he's okay with you not being good.
Yeah, but I think it also goes back to just like what's your goal when you're rolling? You know, is that culture win-lose culture, or is it a culture of development? You know, and there is something to training in a fatigued state. You know, because if you can, like, that's one of the few times to me that you actually get a chance to take somebody's physical attributes away. You know, like if you're just always faster than me, and you finally get fatigued, which you are, of course, naturally, when you finally get somebody fatigued to that point where they're not faster than you, now what happens? You know, is it that you have been beating me all this time because of your speed, or was it your technique? And I just didn't realize that your technique was that good because all I ever saw was your speed. So now we get a chance to test, hey, am I really beating these people, or am I really doing these things because of my technique and my skill, or is it because I'm using a physical attribute I didn't even realize? You know, and until you get into a fatigued enough state, you don't know. Um, you know, because the multiple people have discussed kind of that idea of like self-policing or some variation or some term basically that means self-policing. Like, you have to be responsible for yourself. Like, are you using technique and skill, or are you just beasting somebody? You know, like you're the one that's primarily responsible for that, and then you have to be willing to listen to other people. But the times that I've seen people really understand it is when they're fatigued. Like because I've told people, and it was fascinating. When Seth was like, um, Ryan Hall just kept telling him like, "Hey, relax, relax, Rick, you're not relaxed." He's like, "I thought I was relaxed." He's like, "You're not relaxed," and it was like that was fascinating to me because I was like, "Man, I feel like I say that on repeat all the time." I was like, "Hey, man, you just gotta like chill a little bit. Like, this is not life and death. Like, I'm not trying to kill you. Like, you can relax a little bit. You know, it's like you're death gripping me nonstop when we get done with this round, and it's like you look like you're about to have a stroke." Uh, and it's like, you know, but it's when you finally get somebody fatigued enough to where they can't do that, they just physically can't do that anymore, that there's an opportunity there. And it's kind of that there's that fine line of like, if they can't modulate themselves enough, they can get hurt.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a chance to go the other way and to get much, much better and realize, man, uh, I need to work on my technique because I'm actually not using good technique. I'm using physical attributes. And over time, like you've discussed and multiple other people have discussed, like over time, whether that's within a training session or within the years of your grappling life, those attributes will diminish. That's just how it works. Like, you get fatigued, your speed goes away. You get fatigued, your strength goes away. Like, those attributes go away over time. And now what are you left with? You're left with that skill and that technique. So if you've done a good job developing it, you still have something to fall back on.
Mm-hmm.
And if you haven't, now you're going to be in trouble, you know? And I know everybody's seen it in both jiu-jitsu matches or just MMA matches. Like, you see it, a guy can get fatigued and he's still able to pull out a win because it was like, oh man, that was so lucky. And it was like, well, I think that was just skill. Like, that guy's just that good at what he does. And maybe he got fatigued because he got punched in the face for 5 minutes and then he came back out the next round and got a submission win. And you're like, well, was that lucky or was that skill? You know?
Yeah, I think what you said there too, when we looked at um, the idea of self-modulation, and that's where the Seth Smith marathon roll, you're not allowed to quit, doesn't violate the Sambo Steve idea of don't do just one more, because the just one more is the one that can hurt you.
Yep.
Your body's telling you stop, you got to stop. If you can modulate, then rather than trying to find that, we'll say, explosive solution, to kind of use Matt Thornton's words, we'll find a technical solution. And maybe for that day, you're too tired or you just don't have the skill. In that case, you're just going to have to lose. And that is a thing that happens too. And if you're willing to just say, you know, let's just say you're a blue belt and you're rolling with a purple belt, or sorry, a white belt with a real good gas tank, you know, like if that day, yeah, you do have more skill than them, but you are fatigued, well, their lack of fatigue may trump your total skill, and that's okay. It's okay to tap that day. That doesn't mean that you got worse. It just means that, you know, you had to acknowledge that this day your skill was not ready to take on their gas tank. At some point it will be, you know, if you continue to practice. But that doesn't mean it is today. Like, and, you know, if we can accept that, then those marathon rolls can be very instructive, just like you said. Like, you can learn to modulate. And you can say, I don't have my power, I don't have my explosiveness, I don't have my speed. Can I use purely what technical solutions I have? And if those aren't good enough, that's okay too. Like, it's okay to tap. And then even to someone who in aggregate is not as good as you. If in this one spot on this one day they caught you, well, that was a lesson. Like now you know what you have to work on, and that can be instructive if you allow it to be. Yep. But if, to use everybody's word, if you let your ego get in the way, well, you might go home limping,
Yeah, no. And you brought it up on multiple podcasts where it was like, I think there's that's why there's so much benefit out of positional sparring, because you brought up, like if a purple belt gets to start and mount on a black belt and subs him, that's going to happen sometimes. Like that's just going to happen. That purple belt is knowledgeable enough and he's starting in a really good position, but that black belt's probably going to have an easier time tolerating that.
Sure. I mean, you take Roger Gracie as a purple belt in the mount. You and I know he was pretty darn good there. You put him there and you're a black belt, you're probably going to eat it. That's just how it is. And that's okay. He was a purple belt. If game to game, if you started, in an open scenario, yeah, maybe that couldn't have happened. But starting in that place, it's funny to me how much situational sparring has come up, because I didn't expect that either. That was, I have studied longevity for a long time, and I didn't. It was on my radar sort of, but I didn't see the level to which so many people have put it to use, and a lot of these coaches have all said similar things, and so it just kind of made sense to me that, like, if the ego side of it, situational sparring almost doesn't eliminate it.
It reduces it significantly, though.
Yeah.
But I think that that kind of positional thing that appears everywhere. I mean, in like all types of sports and skills training, like positional things just appear.
Yeah, if you look at wrestling rooms, I mean, this is. I hope someday we can get Ben Askren, but he has a really famous, quote when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and saying, like, all jiu-jitsu places are doing it wrong. If I want someone in my wrestling room to get good in the front headlock, I do not allow him to just wrestle. I put him in the front headlock, and then they start there. And then as soon as one person does something that changes the position, we stop and restart.
Mm-hmm. Jean-Jacques talks about that too in one or two of his books, where he's like, if I have a student that says like, hey, I'm having trouble getting out of mount, he goes, I just put him in mount. And he goes, if he gets out, I put him back in mount again. And I put him back in mount until I can't hold him in mount anymore. And it was like, well, that's probably a pretty good way to be like, well, how am I going to get out of mount? He just put me in mount, And so but it's fascinating. It's like that appears in a lot of different martial arts. And depending on like your school or your lineage, it may or may not have appeared in your jiu-jitsu school very much, I know for me, it's like it appeared in different aspects of my martial arts history. And like, I know to me, like when I go back to being able to teach again, like that's one of the big things I'm going to start incorporating more and more of, is that idea of positional sparring. Because that does appear all across the board, like you see top level coaches do that. Like Greg Jackson was doing that nonstop with his fighters. It's like he puts them, it's like, oh, we're going to put this person, they're going to start with their back on the cage. We're going to give them 3 moves to get their back off the cage. And he's like, yeah, for the next 30 minutes, that's all you're doing. It's like, you get your back off the cage, go put your back on the cage. And like that's all they do over and over and over again. It's just this developing that muscle memory. And again, it's another aspect of skill development, but it has been really interesting to see how many people are like positional sparring. Because like tons of people are bringing it up, whether it's from like, hey, we're just going to work on Uchimata today and we're going to find out which Uchimata works, or, like this guy can't get out of a front headlock. Well, you should probably put him in that front headlock a bunch of times until he can get out of it,
Or he quits.
Or he quits, either one. Yeah, that's probably another good one. That's, especially if Askren's the one putting him in that front headlock, they're probably just quitting, But that has been another theme that has popped up quite a bit, and definitely something that should be incorporated, I think, kind of basically in anything from a martial arts standpoint is like you should be doing positional stuff, you know.
And this goes also to something I'm so glad that Vlad Kulikov brought it up, because I have my Iowa Hawkeyes cup. I'm a huge fan of Iowa wrestling. My wife went there, so I'm an Iowa fan by de facto and default. But I think that our wrestling culture and maybe our grappling culture in general has been so influenced by Dan Gable and what Vlad Kulikov called this grinder mentality of just go, that we may have gone pretty far into the side of survivorship bias, where rather than building up technical athletes, we're just selecting for those who can take that sort of really hard, heavy, just club you to death and condition you to death until your joints either break or you are just like
Indestructible. Yeah,
indestructible. And so when we talk about positional sparring, I think also when we go into the longevity of skill development, if you and I grind at each other, just like all day, like wrestling one another or whatever, that's an entirely different physical load than if we spend 5 minutes apiece on each other's back and just doing back escapes or submission drills.
Mm-hmm.
And then mount or whatever. I think, like I said, it really surprised me how much skill development seems to be intertwined with longevity, and then positional sparring seems to flow in that too, because you can move intensely, but somehow the intensity is lower. And I don't necessarily know how it is, but almost everyone seems to agree that it is beneficial, both from a skill development and also of like a fatigue and adaptation standpoint.
I think because of the parameters you're setting, right? So if it's like, I'm going to put you in this front headlock, and the second you get out of the front headlock, we're going back to the front headlock again. It's like there's very clear cut stuff, as opposed to like, man, once you're out of that front headlock, all bets are off, like have at it,
Yeah.
And you may be incredibly fatigued just getting out of that front headlock. And now suddenly when the gloves are off, like that dude clubs you and you die because like you couldn't handle anymore. But if it was like front headlock, took all that work to get out of it, and then we reset and put you back in the front headlock again, your partner also has a sense of like, hey, this guy's not doing so well right now. Like, I can modulate myself now and say like, and that happens, like I know that, like I have felt that doing kind of Shark Tank style drills with people where it was like, especially when I learned wrestling, I was lucky with like my wrestling coach. We did things like that where it was like all that happens, like we'd put a guy in the middle for 5 minutes and three of us, it was like, all we would do is shoot. Your only goal was to sprawl and get back up. And so it was like after about 2 minutes in, you're kind of just getting pushed over, and then it's like you get a weighted dummy just kind of holding you until you kind of work your way back up, but nobody ever got hurt. In any of those rounds that we did, nobody got hurt. And it was fascinating to be like, look at how fatigued this person is. Like they can't pull themselves up off the ground, but nobody got hurt. Because we had those clear parameters of like, hey, once they get up, get off of them. Or once this happens, right? And so I think some of that is like, you can go pretty intensely if it's like, but the second his butt touches the ground, stop.
Yeah. I think another thing that you're kind of getting at there is by setting those parameters, we might be eliminating scrambles.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no scramble at the end of, some change, that scramble might be the risky spot.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you and I are in back control and I'm holding you in back control and you break free of my hooks and you get away, if like we both weigh about 180, if we both start throwing that 180 pounds around as hard and fast as we can to win the scramble, then that might be an elevated risk of, something, injurious happening. Whereas if I have you in back control, you break free of my hooks and you're out, and then we slap, bump, and start again. We eliminated that high speed kind of, explosive, we'll say, maneuvering of all of our weight, which is, like a scramble is a race to base in a lot of ways. And race to base is kind of a race to move your hips, better than the other person. And that's a lot of mass. That's a lot of, especially move ballistically, that's a lot of change.
Yeah, I think transitions in general are a time of kind of increased risk. So both kind of within grappling, but also like if you're transitioning and you're training, doing more volume, you have to decrease that intensity because you just transitioned your training from kind of, lower volume, a high intensity, and you suddenly go high volume and you try to go high intensity, you just made a transition, right? So it's that same kind of principle. That transition opens up a window for potential of injury to happen, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just that it's that very same thing of like a transition in a grappling match or a transition in training time or intensity, things like those variables. All those things just open up a window for potential like kind of injury,
Yep. Another element that has been brought up a lot in, I think intuitively we all kind of knew it, but I didn't necessarily see how important it was, is the idea of joyful or fun training that is close to play, and how quickly the learning curve can be affected by play. So our language between you and I has been competitive, not combative. And we talked about having like that training partner that you have this rivalry with that's friendly. Well, effectively that becomes roughhousing, right? It's technical roughhousing, which is play. And then Rob Bernanke talked about, they have a drill that they do in every class that they call "fuck your jujitsu."
Mm-hmm.
Basically, inhibit your ability either to grip or to do this or to do that in such a way that it becomes like a goofy game. And then through that game, the spirit of the game seems to increase the rate of human learning. And I really liked his language on that because he said play is a very resource expensive thing to do. It takes a lot of brain power. It takes a lot of energy. If it didn't provide a huge value to the person or animal doing it, then it
would
would
have gone away. Yeah.
out. Evolution would not have allowed it to stay.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought of myself as fairly on on top of a type of dude, but when he said that, it all intuitively makes perfect sense. But I never put that together. You know what I mean? I wouldn't have put that together without that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that was really awesome to hear that, where it's like, if something didn't work, it would have gone away. So it clearly worked. So why not use it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that like you see in certain schools, like Cobrinha does it. You sent me that video where he's doing all this guard retention stuff. He's holding on to tennis balls at the same time. And that's fun.
Right.
And
There's no consequence to losing. Like if you lose, sure, you're like maybe the white belt passed you that day, but you had freaking tennis balls in your hands.
Exactly. So, and again, it kind of goes back to that idea that we talked about, where it's like, if the purple belt gets to start and mount and he beats the black belt, well, we could probably expect that.
We'll laugh at this and go on.
I mean, or it's like, shoot, you get a white or blue belt who's been doing it for a year or two, and they're on the black belt's back, starting there. They can probably give them, some problems, because like they have enough understanding of those concepts to give that person a problem, So it's not, it's not the end of the world. Like that guy choked you that day. Okay. and
Yes.
like he started on your back with the choke sunk partway in, like you got choked. Okay, well, move on, figure out the next thing, like.
Yeah.
But I think like my hope is that like as we kind of come out of the back end of this whole COVID situation, that we see that develop a lot more, and that we see a lot more schools really focusing on this skill development technique, play. It's one of the big things. Whenever if you have Jim back on the show again, you really should discuss kind of play for kids. Like he's got really fascinating information on that stuff, and just like how to develop kids through play.
Mm-hmm.
But that idea of play, and Rob bringing that up, that was just like, well, I never would have looked at it that way ever. Of like, if play wasn't that important, like it would have gone away. But it's never gone away. Like play has always been around in some fashion, and it's like, well, if it's that beneficial, how can we incorporate it?
Yeah.
And how it turns out there's tons of ways of incorporating play, without even saying like, hey, we're just playing. You can incorporate it. It's like, no, this is a drill. Like it's a drill for us to hold tennis balls in our hands and do guard passing. But that's really, you're just playing. I mean, like we're just playing at that point.
I think even the language like saying "fuck your jujitsu" is a it's like an encoding mechanism. Where if you're saying we're doing a drill, then suddenly it's going to be like, oh, I'm drilling. But it's just like, fuck your jujitsu, like I'll do whatever. You're just it's a way of turning off that, like I think the like Henner and Huron use like keep it playful.
Mm-hmm.
To a certain degree, they might take it a little bit in a place that I'm not sure. I mean, who the hell am I to say? But they might take it to a place where it's like, maybe too far. But if we're isolating and saying, okay, for fuck your jujitsu time period, it's just going to be goofy play, then there's just this window and opportunity to just have consequence-free, roughhousing. And then the movement that you develop in that, you can then apply to your not playful, but like, competitive roles.
Mm-hmm.
So I may be misunderstanding Henry and Huron, but they are saying the same thing. I may just be misinterpreting what they're trying to get across, which is probably when they say keep it playful, they're saying like keep it consequence free. Like it's okay to lose if you're getting better. You're losing, but in the name of trying to find, vulnerabilities or places where you need work. And that's a viable and important skill. Just like you said, self-assessment. That's what that is.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're never putting yourself in, a place to be vulnerable, then maybe those little holes aren't ever being exposed, because we definitely know people who are talented enough and skilled enough to keep, for the most part, the grappling game within, their sort of A game or high level places where they're not vulnerable. But someone may come along who is able to keep that from happening. Mm-hmm. Like Ryan Hall, and I fanboy on Ryan Hall all the time, but he talked about that. It's like he felt very confident in his deep half guard, 50-50 work triangles, and he went to train with Marcelo Garcia for a time. And he's like, just writing down like what I'm going to do to Marcelo, where am I going to take him? And he's like, got bad news for everybody. I took him all those places. It didn't fucking matter. Which I think is pretty, that's instructive too. Like, to me, there's always going to be somebody out there that can find your spot. So the more time you shore up other, your vulnerabilities, the more you can go away from that game if that game's not working.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Well, I feel like we've gone, pretty far. Was there anything super high points that we missed that you wanted to discuss? Because I've kind of driven it, but I also wanted to get your take on it. Because like I said, this was more about, trying to distill your experience, to better my understanding of what, we've learned so far.
No, I think, really, I think we hit most of it. It was, these people have just been so awesome with all the information they've been willing to share. And it's also been awesome to see these common points and common themes just pop up person to person. And it's like, if you have these top level experts who've never had any conversations with each other, all saying the same thing, we should probably listen to them because they're probably they're pretty smart people. So we can probably listen to them. So, no, I don't think we've kind of, I think we've hit on kind of the major points I really took home with like the culture and skill development and fundamentals and honest self-assessments and things like that. I think those have been kind of the big things, and all those play factors into the main goal of just longevity in this art or in whatever you want to do. I think we could probably go just even further out of it and say, like, man, you could apply a lot of these things to just longevity and whatever you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you absolutely hate going to work every single day, you're probably not going to make it very long in that job. You might, but you're probably going to suffer as a result of it. But if you love going to work and it's kind of play for you as opposed to work, it's going to be more fun. You're going to enjoy it and probably keep going back to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in the East they say, when you find the way in one thing, you find it in all things.
Mm-hmm.
In the West, we might say excellence leaves tracks. I think that those are probably two ways of saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that being really good at something is the language that I like is from Dean Lister, who said it's simple but not easy.
Yeah.
Because it's simple, it's not hard to understand, but it's gonna be work. It's gonna take time and it's gonna take dedication. Which that's certainly borne itself out in all of these interviews, and we've heard a lot of the same things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping I can get Dean Lister on. He's definitely an old roller. He has such a strange way of phrasing things that he would be fun just to talk to. And I don't want that to sound like an insult, because it's not. I think sometimes when you're like really brilliant at something, you can make it seem really simple.
Mm-hmm.
Other people who are really brilliant at something, it takes you like a couple of passes before you can make sense of what they're saying, because it's so far beyond, like your own understanding. I think that's where Lister is. Like, Lister's one of those guys, like, I listen to him and I'm like, I'll get that, but it might take me a minute, I'm gonna have to bring it back a time or two.
You got to get Barnett on here too. He'd be a fun one to have on. If you want to talk about an old roller, he's been on the block a time or two. So
he's certainly performed at the highest levels for a very long time.
Very long time.
You have to admire that. And once again, it comes from catch wrestling, which we would think it has a reputation as being something that you probably don't have much longevity in. Seems like if it's done, right, that's not necessarily the truth. So, well, Michael, thank you so much for your time and your insight. It's been fun to listen to you again and learn from you. We didn't get to go over your episode specifically. I was going to do the talking and just make you sit there.
We'll have to save that for the next one.
But there were a lot of great insights. I would say there's a lot of commonality between the things that you had to say and also some of these great coaches and trainers from a bunch of different fields. So I've said a lot of mean things about you while we were in the downtime. So I'll say one nice thing while you're still here.
That's fair.
Alrighty. Well, once again, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks.